ARC after the seminar. So please bear that in mind when you're asking any questions and participating. I'm recording it from now. Thanks, Andre. Over to you, Kirsten. Thanks.
Okay, well then, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and yeah, thanks a lot for organizing this and for asking me to present a paper in this series. Thanks to all of you out there whom I can't see, unfortunately, for joining me for this presentation today. At least here in Copenhagen, it's a super nice Friday afternoon, so thanks for spending your time with me and this presentation. Yeah, for my part, I'm super happy to present this project today that I have with Holger and Christoph, and in which we investigate how it can happen that an accounting topic can attract the broad political attention. So this is more or less what the first part of our fairly long title is about. So we say, yeah, that accounting problems do not exist per se, but they have to be constructed. So there have to be some people out there who construct accounting as a public policy issue. And yeah, what does that mean? We don't mean by that that this is just one or two guys sitting in their offices and calling their local governmental representative. But this is about, yeah, people attracting the broad political attention to an accounting problem. Okay, and yeah, this happens surprisingly often, so that accounting is becoming a public policy issue, as you can see here. So this is yeah, a headline. Oh, wait, these are different headlines from newspaper articles. So the first one would be on the case where European politicians defined a part of EIS 39 as problematic. So when they were deciding to adopt IFRS back in the beginning of the 2000s, yeah, they decided to carve out a part of the standards that they perceived as being problematic. Then the second headline is also a different case. So there we have now the stock options debate that took place in the US. Then the latter two headlines relate to the case that we are actually now looking at, namely the fair value debate during the financial crisis, where both politicians in the EU intervened in standard setting, as well as yeah, in the US. So yeah, it happens quite often, yet yeah, it's pretty unclear how it is happening that yeah, people can attract the broad political attention to accounting. So this is roughly what we are aiming at. So to better understand this process, how this can happen. And as I said before, we are taking on this social constructionism perspective. So we say, well, accounting problems do not exist per se. There needs to be someone out there who constructs accounting as being problematic or as being necessary for being taken into consideration by public policymakers. And to address this research question, we use this case of the fair value accounting debate during the financial crisis. So yeah, for those who are old enough to recall what happened back then and were already interested in business newspapers, yeah, they may have seen some of those headlines on how fair value accounting was questioned or challenged for being partially responsible for the financial crisis. And what we did was that we looked into newspapers from the UK, from France, from Germany, as well as the US, and extracted statements of different unique individual persons on fair value accounting. And yeah, as you can see here, the numbers, we found quite a lot of them. So yeah, 1,650 statements on fair value accounting had been published in those different newspapers over the time 2007 to 2009. Those statements belong to almost 800 different individual actors. So yeah, I think that also reflects pretty well that yeah, we don't only have like a handful of high-level politicians or a handful of CEOs that complain about fair value accounting rules, or one or two standard setters that defend those rules, but it has been a really, really broad debate, and we're covering yeah, a lot of different statements here by different people. And then our theoretical approach to address this research question, how people construct accounting as a public policy issue, is to use framing theory to make sense of this process. So this translates, if you want, the research question into how do different social actors frame the issue of fair value accounting over time. So we apply Goffman, and that translates the debate on fair value accounting into something that Goffman calls a frame contest. So in a frame contest, different actors, so people who use frames to convince a frame target in this case, or in the framing terminology, to take action in their favor, right? And those different actors compete for the interpretation of a current situation. And yeah, a nice feature of framing theory is, from our point of view, that you can use the observable frames in the debate to link them to the actors' beliefs in different core objectives of accounting, or if you want, the core purpose of financial reporting, or the role of accounting in society in general. Oh, yeah, I had some more informations here. So, but let me now briefly summarize our key takeaways. So the first one would be that the construction of a public policy issue requires actors to emphasize accounting objectives that are not incorporated in standard setters conceptual frameworks. So what we mean by that is that actors need to construct a collective social problem instead of an accounting problem. When accounting problem can be defined as something where actors raise attention to potential violations of traditional accounting objectives. So by traditional accounting objectives, we mean something like decision usefulness, like in terms of information being relevant for users of financial reports, however you want to define that, as well as the faithful representation of economic reality. And those traditional accounting objectives are incorporated in the standard setters conceptual frameworks. So they are really, really relevant for the standard setters because they have to meet those objectives because they have sort of included them in their conceptual frameworks as their guiding principles, if you want, but they are not that relevant for public policy makers. So public policy makers probably do not really care about whether some measurement concept is more suitable to be a faithful representation than something else, than another measurement concept. So that would be an accounting problem. And on the other hand, you can also think about accounting becoming a collective social problem. And there the actor would need to raise the attention of another person to the potentially detrimental economic effects of financial reporting. And by that, we do not mean like economic effects that results from the enhancement of transparency. So that is actually also what standard setters are claiming, that they are caring about the economic effects. in terms of what financial reporting does for capital markets by providing transparent information. But this is more about other economic effects, such as the financial stability. And those objectives, if you want, are very relevant for public policymakers, but not that relevant for standard setters, because it is not part of their set of objectives that they have defined in their conceptual framework. Right, so that would be the first takeaway. So in order to construct a public policy issue, actors do need to take this additional step from defining accounting as being problematic to defining accounting as being a social problem, so a collective problem for society. And then the second takeaway that we offer by our paper is that the construction of public policy issue also depends on the robustness of shared belief systems in society. From my point of view, this is probably the most interesting finding of our paper, namely that you need to have a shift in shared belief systems in society to see the emergence of a public policy issue, and to see public policy makers actually taking specific actions. So this box here sort of represents what we already know. So this is that the conceptual framework is said to be able to generally serve standard setters as a weapon of defense or a political resource to reduce the threat of a government intervention, and that it is a manifestation of standard setters' beliefs in the role of accounting in society. And arguably, this standard setters' beliefs in the role of accounting in society is also shared by a considerable part of their constituents, because I mean the conceptual framework is developed in a public consultation process. So it's not only the standard setters believing what is written in the conceptual framework, but it's a considerable part of the accounting constituents who share this belief. And currently we have something that those two people down there in this blue brackets labeled the traditional view of accounting, according to which standard setters should focus on securing financial accounting's ability to faithfully represent economic truth. So that would be basically how they define traditional view of accounting and how we use it in our paper. And then there is a competing view of accounting that actors can have, and that is what they labeled the radical view of accounting. So in this way of sense making or thinking, the standard setters should also consider the economic effects of their standards. So that again would go to the direction of economics effects in terms, not only in terms of enhancing transparency and efficiency of capital markets, but like also goals like financial stability. And what we find in the paper is that this radical view of accounting gained in importance over time during the financial crisis, but it ultimately did not supplant the traditional view of accounting. So this original view of accounting, which is also incorporated in the standard setters conceptual framework, actually proved to be very robust during the financial crisis. And the arguable consequences were that politicians actually justified their interventions, so to push the standard setters for fair value accounting changes based on traditional accounting objectives. So for example, in the EU, politicians said, well, you have to harmonize IFRS with US GAAP because you cannot compare IFRS reports with US GAAP reports anymore. So yeah, please IASB, please adjust your standards to make them comparable with US GAAP. And another consequence that we find is that there has been no overhaul of the oversight structure of the standard setters that people also pushed for, or an overhaul. There was also no overhaul of the standard setters conceptual frameworks. And yeah, as we all know, we still apply fair value accounting or fair value measurements as of today. So that also survived this construction process of a public policy issue. And then finally, the third takeaway that we offer is that contextual factors actually have a significant effect on the relative framing power of different constituents. So here, instead of focusing more or less traditionally on actors' economic power, we in our paper focus on something called the actors' framing power. So this would be a more subtle way in which power operates, you could argue. More or less means how convincing are actually different actors' frames for standard setters or public policy makers, and this how convincing it is. So the resonance of a particular frame very much depends on contextual factors. So, for example, the occurrence of frame shifting events. And to give you a spoiler alert here, there would be financial crisis events, as well as the actors' framing consistency. So that means the actors' framing consistency over time, but also within a specific group of constituents. Okay, so that would be the summary of what we do. And I would be ready. So this is just the slide that you saw before. And I would be ready to take some questions and use this one as a background slide.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. Marco, you have a question.
Okay. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi.
I'm a little bit, I have difficulties in understanding the difference between accounting standard setter and public policy maker. I would consider accounting standard setter as a subset of public policy maker. They just, accounting standard are public policy regulation that deals with a certain part of, I would like to understand what is your definition of public policy maker and why an accounting standard setter is not, by definition, a public policy maker itself.
Mm-hmm. That we just take the perspective. I mean, easy argument would be just to say, well, standard setters are private organizations, right? So they received authorization to set accounting standards from public policymakers. So that's basically the argument. And I mean, if you want to push for a change in accounting, you have those different levels, regulatory levels that you can address and that you can raise your concerns to. So you have the standard setters. So those, in our view, would not be public policy makers, but sort of private organizations that have the authority to make rules, but they are legitimized by public policymakers. So this would be standard setters on the first level. And then you would have a second level, which would be public policymakers, which have a de facto veto power to overhaul whatever the standard setters do. Does that answer it?
Yes, I still believe that it's difficult to argue that standard setters are not aware of their public policy role when they issue a standard. But I pause and I let other people time. Okay.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks, Marco. Charles, you have a question as well and some references for us.
Yes, hi. Thanks for this beginning of presentation. I always enjoy listening to public policy issues. I posted some references. I don't expect them to see them because you're presenting for the audience. There are a few already some papers documenting issues, like large issues that's going from tax laws, from Auditor Litigation Security Act in the US, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which we all know. They have been examined through the lens of public policy issues. So the fact that accounting regulations or accounting policies are political and public policy issues is sort of known. So my question is, besides the fact that the context is obviously different and the legislation itself is different, what's the main difference with what you're trying to do? I also know that your framing is also different, but is that really another sort of story of saying, okay, accounting policy is political, but we've been knowing this for a while. I mean, I posted references that date from 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to
Yeah.
see what you could bring to the table with this current story, which is interesting. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm just trying to see what stands out from your research.
Yes, I mean, you're definitely right that it is very well established in the literature that accounting standard setting is a political process or has a political dimension. And I also added those different headlines in the beginning to show you, well, it frequently reoccurs that accounting is becoming a public policy issue, but what is not that well understood is how actually accounting is becoming a public policy issue, and that is what we try to shed light on here with our paper.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks, Charles. Joachim, you have a question as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is related to your characterization as of the conceptual framework. So I always understood the conceptual framework as an attempt to keep the political barbarians off the gate. So to make sure that the IASB can actually do their job, and I clearly see that this is in the interest of the IASB, but I'm not that sure whether there is a consensus among experts that this is the right way to move forward. So to me, there seems to be many experts that agree that accounting, but almost by definition, is a public policy issue. So I'm very close to Marco in that regard. So I understand this more as a conflict between, let's say, the institution of the IASB wants to have a modus of operandum where they are not being forced to deal with political pressure all the time, and let's say the public that from time to time actually wants to see accounting being debated as a public policy issue, which in principle it should be. Yeah, so, and I think this is a little bit different from the way that you presented it, but maybe I'm wrong.
So I lost the question that was in your outline.
No, so you said that you presented that the IASB has a conceptual framework that has support by its constituents, and then there are some actors, framing actors, that take this radical view and try to push accounting into something that it technically is not or was not. Yeah. Whereas I'm saying accounting was always a public policy issue, and there is the IASB that tries to steer clear of it for individual rational reasons, but then there are the other players that want the IASB to act politically, basically.
Okay, so yeah, what you're basically saying is that the broad consensus would be in society that you should, if I may use this term, use this radical view of accounting, so that standard setters should always have in mind the economic effects of their standards, because they have a wealth shifting effect on society. So it is a political issue at all times. And then you have the standard setter that tries to keep away this political dimension and set up this traditional view of accounting, namely that it's only there to provide decision useful information. But the argument that we use here is that, I mean, there are parts in society that actually support the standard setter with its view, so that it should actually only take care of providing transparent information to markets, and that it should not take care about each and every dimension, economic effects that their standards could have, because there are other public policy makers that could amend their rules to take care that accounting standards don't have detrimental effects.
Okay.
Thank you, Kirsten. We just have one more question from Tim, and then we'll move on if that's okay with you. Tim, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, Kirsten, you started off by talking about this framing contest, and I actually really like the way you used that here. But I was wondering, are there any other, let's say, contests that would apply here? Is there like any other literature on how these decisions are made? Is there maybe skill contests or something else that's not just the framing itself, but also the way how skilled the actors involved appear might play into this process?
Mm-hmm. How skilled the actors are. I mean, we take this up to some extent when we look at actors framing power. So there we take into account the contextual factors, what we call it. So what makes one person's frame more convincing or less convincing than another one's. I mean, a very prominent way of looking at it would be to just look at people's political or economic power. So how many resources does an actor have to mobilize support for his or her idea or
So just to be sure here, does the framing contest comes from the fact that also these politicians have to explain their decision to their voters and have to frame their decisions there? So that's where the framing contest comes in the stage earlier, where they have to decide on what they're doing. Because I try to understand a little bit of why the framing contest, the framework of the framing contest would be applicable here, and whether there are other frameworks that one could use to explain this decision making here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we are looking here at an interpretation, I would say, of a situation that slowly unravels over time. So it is very unclear at the beginning of 2008 how you should interpret this situation, and that's why, from our point of view, this framing concept works pretty well, because people are trying to convince each other about their perception of the reality. And then later on, you might be right that it's then also an issue about providing politicians with arguments to back their claims, what standard setters have to do.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, Kirsten. You're happy to progress with the slides now?
All right. So then let me next introduce you in some more depth our framing perspective. So as I said before, we take on the social constructionism perspective, where we say, well, different people perceive reality or a situation differently. And let me just have a thought experiment with you. So let's assume that you and I are hiking in the woods, and then we meet this fellow over here. And you and I, we may interpret the situation very differently, right? You may say this is an unproblematic situation because I know the way the wolf looks, it doesn't seem to be interested in eating us. While I interpret this situation as being highly problematic. And our two interpretations according to framing theory, would depend on our primary framework. So our schematas of interpretation that we have. So what kind of personal backgrounds do we have that define our way of believing in things and interpreting things. So for example, I might have only read Grimm's fairy tales, and therefore in my perspective, all wolves are evil, and therefore I interpret this situation where we meet the wolf as being highly problematic, whilst someone else might have a background in zoology, and he or she may know that wolves are peaceful animals, and giving this background, or if you want, belief system, he or she will interpret this situation as being unproblematic. And now, if the zoologist and I enter into an argumentation, we will frame the situation differently. So for example, I would summarize the situation in a frame that more or less draws the conclusion that I almost died by this experience, while the zoologist might say, that was a really awesome experience. So he would, if I can switch over to the definition, what framing means, he would select the aspects of this perceived reality in a way to promote a particular problem definition. Well, in this case, it would not be a problem definition, but actually this perceived reality that wolves are, the conclusion that wolves are actually peaceful animals. And he would maybe then come to draw the conclusion as a treatment recommendation. So what should we do based on this situation? He would maybe draw the conclusion, it's so awesome that we ended up in this situation, seeing a wolf, that was great, was unproblematic, so we should have more wolves in our woods, while I would frame the situation as having been very, very dangerous. And my treatment recommendation that I would offer then would be, well, we need to get rid of all of those wolves. And our aim by engaging in such a frame contest, to use another term from framing theory, would be actually to convince an ultimate frame target. So we also try to convince each other, of course, but in the end, the goal would be to convince someone who can solve the situation for us. So I don't know, that might be a local government representative that decides on how many wolves live in the woods. So that is the core idea of framing theory. And just to give you another illustration about how frames and primary frameworks are interconnected. So the frames is what you can see in the public debate. So those are the statements that we can observe. And based on this top of the iceberg, we can draw conclusions on the different normative belief systems that different actors have about essential characteristics, in this case of wolves, or about the role of accounting in society in other frame contests. Okay, so now let's go back to our subject of interest. So how public policy issues are constructed and how we conceptualize this now as a frame contest. So that's a statement that I said before. So we assume that accounting problems do not exist per se, so they are not there objectively, but there need to be some actors who interpret a situation and then construct a situation as being highly problematic. And the same is true for public policy issue. So their constituents need to construct an issue, so that in this case it would be a collective social problem that attracts broad political attention. And that construction process would take the form of a frame contest. So it's not only one party that is able to freely construct problems, but there is most of the times another party that fights back and tries to prevent that the frame target adopts this specific problem definition and also the treatment recommendation that is based on it. So that is what we mean by frame contest. And the frame sponsors framing, so the actors framing can differ because, as I said, they may have those different primary frameworks that guides their sense making. And additionally, they may also frame strategically. Ultimately, the frame targets interpretation. So that would be now the standard setter or the public policymaker in our way of thinking. Their interpretation would again be affected by their primary framework and or the frame sponsors framing power, so their credibility. So again, to draw on this metaphor, so the frame is what we can observe, and then the primary framework in this context would be the normative belief systems about the purpose of financial accounting or its role in society. And I introduced those different perspectives at the beginning. And this is based on a discussion that Solomons and Tinker had back in 1991, sorry. And they distinguish between different views that people can have on the role of accounting. And they label the traditional view of accounting as something as, that the purpose of accounting is to provide information that is useful to decision makers and to provide a faithful representation of the underlying economic phenomena. And that infers that you can have two camps under this traditional view, one that would like to focus on the decision usefulness part or relevance part, and the other camp that would like to focus on the accountability or stewardship function of accounting, so this reliability or faithful representation part. And overall, under the traditional view, people would assume that financial accounting is only representing economic reality, but that it is not constructing economic reality, as people who follow the radical view or activist view may believe. So under the radical view, people define the purpose of accounting as being there to generate desirable economic effects. And one example might be financial stability. And then the last view that you have would be the activist view. And there you would say, well, the purpose of accounting is actually just to support the government's realization of economic and societal goals. So governments can change over time. Accounting should just be something that suits their purpose. So there you may think about people who say that accounting should be available for politicians as a regulatory forbearance tool in financial crisis to ease pressure on struggling firms. Okay, so then let's move on to our case. So now it's about understanding the debate on fair value accounting as a frame contest. So that's something that we already covered a little bit in the discussion. So in 2007, 2008, this has been the situation. So what people were observing was that one market after the other was collapsing, like these houses. And the big question was then, well, is fair value accounting acting here as a catalyst, or is it maybe acting as a stabilizer so that it can stop this chain reaction? And we argue that based on the different primary frameworks or different views on the role of accounting in society that people can have, people will interpret and then also frame the situation differently. So in the case of fair value accounting, people may either argue, well, fair value accounting actually is reflecting only reality, and therefore it will help us to weather this crisis and to survive these severe times, while others may actually argue, well, fair value accounting is very problematic because now we have these illiquid markets, and given that we force companies to use market prices that are based on very, very few transactions, well, can we actually be confident that these fair values are reflecting the economic truth, or are these fair values actually reflecting a distorted reality because the efficient market hypothesis is not holding up anymore? And the same is true for allowing firms to deviate from mark-to-market accounting to using model-based fair values. So there people said, well, if we use those model-based fair values, those could be subject to biased management estimates, or they could reflect biased management estimates. And then when we apply those fair values, we again do not reflect reality, but we reflect a distorted reality. And then in the third sort of frame, people were arguing, well, fair value accounting is not reflecting reality, it is constructing reality. So it is actually here this catalyzer. It is aggravating the crisis. It is forcing banks to sell assets and further depressing market prices, forcing more banks to sell more assets and so on and so forth. And then, you would end up with this conclusion or interpretation. So let me then move on to the material that we were using. So as you know, our focus is on debate and argumentation, and apparently we look at the public debate on fair value accounting, and to capture what was going on publicly, we decided to use newspaper material. So as I said at the beginning, we collected a lot of statements from different European and US newspapers. And that has been a very exciting time during my PhD to study all this material. And in addition, whenever it was possible, we also drew on the primary sources, so the sources that got cited by the journalists, and used them in our paper. And let me now also show you how our coding process looked like. So this was our first step in the analysis, or if you want the first order analysis. So we decided to use those, or to build our coding structure on the different framing elements as defined by Benford and Snow. So that would be a diagnosis. So that would be the attribution of blame for a specific situation. Then we would have the prognosis. So that would be the treatment recommendation a person may have. And then we have a motivation for the diagnosis as well as the prognosis. So that would, yeah, basically be arguments to back the blame attribution and the treatment recommendation. And yeah, as you can see here, we used MaxQDA to do this, and we coded all those different statements. So yeah, this gives you here an yeah, idea of the many coding or codes that we used in the analysis. Yeah, what we did with our raw material, if you want. So that was our first yeah, order analysis, if you want, and we took this to the second order analysis by aggregating or yeah, rearranging the coded material into different frames that were used in the frame contest to, yeah, to allow us to make a meaningful analysis. So we identified and labeled 3 different frames based on our material. So the first one we labeled the transparency frame, and there people would attribute blame to managers. So it's not fair value accounting that was responsible for the crisis, but yeah, it's the management's faults. And the diagnosis would just be, yeah, fair value accounting, there's nothing wrong with it, it is just mirroring the reality. And accordingly, you would recommend that you either maintain or maybe improve the standards in the long term, or that you may even want to extend the use of fair value accounting. And then you have a list of different arguments to back your blame attribution and the treatment recommendation. And yeah, so that would be the top of the iceberg, so the frame that is observable in the debate. But based on this observable material, we can then draw the conclusion, well, these people who use the transparency frame, they are actually believing in the traditional view of accounting with a particular focus on decision usefulness. Yeah, and the second frame that we identified would be what we label the faithful representation frame. So there the diagnosis would be that fair value accounting is problematic in illiquid markets, so that fair value accounting under certain circumstances only mirrors a distorted reality. And for this reason, fair value accounting needs to be improved, or we need more guidance right now to solve this accounting problem. Or another prognosis might be, well, you shouldn't extend fair value accounting to financial assets and liabilities that are not really frequently traded or not traded at all. So where you would have to rely on management's estimates. And then you have again a bunch of arguments that can back the prognosis and diagnosis. And again, this upper part here is what is visible, and you can draw conclusions on the basis of this visible part, that these people who use the faithful representation frame were actually believing in the traditional view of accounting too. But here now the focus was more on the accountability or stewardship part, and to a lesser extent on the decision usefulness part. And then finally, we have something that we called the financial stability frame. So that would be people who say, well, fair value accounting is partially or completely responsible for the crisis because it is constructing reality, and people who are arguing that we therefore need a fundamental change of fair value accounting or even the abolishment of fair value accounting rules. And that would relate to the primary framework of the radical or activist view of accounting, where the focus in this particular case of the fair value accounting debate would be on the objective of financial stability. Okay, so now before I move on with the empirical part. I could take another break if you like.
Thanks, Kirsten. We have another question from Marco. Marco, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, I appreciate this willingness to distinguish the radical view from the transparency view, but I'm not sure that you necessarily get a different conclusion depending on the view that you actually take. Okay, you can, even starting from the, you call it traditional faithful representation view, you can argue that fair value accounting in a way facilitated the crisis, but in a natural and a normal way. And so I don't think that you have to buy into what Tony Tinker would call the constructivist view of accounting in order to argue that fair value accounting allowed the market to react as it should have reacted, which was by correcting the value of overvalued assets. And the only way of doing that was to sell and create a crash. To call somebody that actually argues for that a radical activist is a little bit of a strong, I think, connotation. You don't have to do that. And in fact, a lot of people that actually argued in favor of that argument were not radical constructivist, neither academic nor politician, but actually pretty much traditional orthodox decision usefulness people. So I see a little bit of a strain between what actually happened and who actually was arguing that fair value accounting had played some sort of amplifying role, and the fact that you call this as if you attribute this argument to a radical constructivist construct on the kind of those that is defended by Tony Tinker, by Christine Cooper, by that kind of academic area. Okay, so can you not get to the same conclusion starting from a transparency framework?
I'm not sure whether I understand what you then mean by a transparency framework. So,
well, the one that you presented in slide 14, okay, you had three framework.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think that you need to buy into the financial, the radical activist view of accounting in order to build the argument that fair value accounting in a way was part of the mechanism that created financial instability when the crisis started. And in fact,
yeah,
a lot of the people that defended that argument were not radical activist thinkers, were actually transparency thinkers. I don't think that you can argue that Yun Shin was a radical activist thinker. Okay, he's a standard orthodox transparency thinker in my classification of the world. And so I don't buy completely the attribution of a certain argument to a certain framing school.
Okay. I'm not sure whether we are definitely not assigning different arguments to different schools of thoughts, I'd say. Maybe it becomes clear when I come to the empirical part, because in my view, those traditional views, radical views, are pretty nicely represented in the statements, because you have people who say, well, accounting's purpose is just to reflect reality, and this is what fair value accounting is doing, and this is why we shouldn't change it. And then you have others, and Whether we should use the label radical or activist view, yeah, that can be debated, but that's how we distinguish those different groups. So the traditional, the people who believe in this traditional view, so that accounting simply is there to reflect economic realities, to others who say, well, accounting does not only reflect realities, it is actually yeah, constructing realities, and this is something that it shouldn't do. And yeah, therefore it is standard setters' task to amend their standards, and not as, for example, standard setters would say, well, then banking regulators may also change their yeah, definition of those capital adequacy levels or whatever. So that's standard setters' arguments. That argument in this case, that the pure accounting function would be reflect whatever whatever the economic reality is right now, and then have other regulators care about possible detrimental effects.
Thanks, Kirsten. Perhaps we can move on to the empirical side. No, thanks.
Okay, so yeah. So here I want to show you more or less abstract what kind of situation people had to interpret at different points in time. So here we are at the beginning of 2007, and back at that time, the two standard setters, the FASB and the IASB, were issuing proposals to use fair values more extensively. So this is the situation that people had to interpret back then. And what we then naturally observe is that people engaged in a frame contest on whether one should actually extend fair value accounting to other, yeah, not only categories of financial instruments, but also more broadly, yeah, other assets and liabilities. And yeah, so people were interpreting this situation as being either problematic, so that standard setters were considering to extend the use of fair values to categories that did not provide yeah, observable market data, would lead to a lack of faithful representation in financial statements, or as being adequate. And the frames that they were then accordingly using were that model-based fair values were no faithful representation. So, for example, here we have a statement of a representative of the American Bankers Association, who was arguing, well, those model-based fair values, they entail the certainty that it is a distortion of reality, because, yeah, you can't trust the manager's estimates. And then we also have an auditor who, for example, states, well, with those model-based fair values, you allow people to pick numbers out of thin air. So, yeah, they were challenging that fair value accounting was able to faithfully represent reality. While then you had other actors, so here you would have an FASB member who would argue, well, but even if they're just based on models by the management, those fair values are more decision useful than the alternative that we could provide investors with, which would be historical values. So investors would rather have a current estimate with adequate disclosure of the subjectivity than the historical cost value. So yeah, this would have been yeah, the better alternative in their point of view. So the bottom line that we can draw when analyzing this frame contest in the early 2000s and early 2008 is that we have a very traditional accounting debate that focuses on an accounting problem. So the question on whether financial reporting objectives are actually fulfilled or not. And then if we move on further down the timeline, we have the situation in the middle of 2007 that markets were drying out. That market liquidity decreased for a lot of financial assets, but that auditors were still enforcing the strict application of mark-to-market accounting. So they were not allowing their clients, so the banks or insurance companies, to deviate from the strict application of mark-to-market accounting to the application of mark-to-model, to apply model-based fair values, therefore a frame contest on the unfolding fair value measurement problems came up, and people interpreted this situation differently. So again, people said either that market prices are now not representative anymore, and that auditors and standard setters should allow firms to deviate and to be able to use more model-based fair values, while others were saying, well, those market prices, even if there are only a few transactions, those market prices are still representative, and people should continue to use market prices as their inputs. If we look at frames, so there we would now have frames that would either highlight that market-based, so now it's not anymore about model-based, but it's about market-based fair values, that they are lacking this criteria of being a faithful representation of reality, because market prices are distorted and now fair values are reflecting a distorted reality. So here, for example, you have the CEO of the insurance company AXA, who says that if you are in the medical business, you want to be sure that the thermometer is the right one for benchmarking things properly. The accounting systems in the economy are the thermometer, and I'm not sure that their measurement scale is the right one today. So he is questioning very politely, but still, whether those market values can actually be applied and reflect economic reality, so that that they can function as a faithful representation. And then the second statement would be by an auditor. So it's not only insurance companies raising these concerns, but here you have an audit partner who says, well, you can see that their point is actually, or that banks have a point in arguing that the markets are irrational right now. So people started to question the efficient market hypothesis and started to question whether market prices are actually able to faithfully represent the economic value of specific financial instruments. And then we had others who were arguing, well, no, even in thinly traded, in thin markets, market prices still reflect the true economic value of the financial asset or liability. So here we have, for example, the Stanford professor Darrell Duffy, who said it is wrong-headed thinking to complain about the market making a mistake. So yeah, even if we have just one transaction, this transaction price should be taken into consideration. This is the faithful representation. So this is a reflection of the true economic value of the asset. And then the other two statements that I copied in here, interestingly reflect the position of the large bank associations at that time. So here you have, for example, Josef Ackermann, who was at that time the CEO of Deutsche Bank, and simultaneously also the chairman of the IIF. So this is the International Association for Banks. And he said, well, the crucial question in the next few days and weeks is, how do we mark the position? And he says, I can only hope that we will not muddle through, that we continue to mark to market. So he also backs this idea, well, we should not deviate. It's still relevant information for investors and market participants, and we should hold or live up to those transparency objectives of the standards. So this was back in September 2007, the first statement, and the second statement is from March 2008. So there he still says, well, even though it has been proven difficult to apply fair value accounting in illiquid markets, we should not start a fundamental discussion at this time, because this would create additional uncertainty and may harm financial stability in this case even more. So he was arguing for, again, keeping mark-to-market accounting in place. So here our bottom line would be that we still have a traditional accounting debate going on in the late 2007 to early 2008 period. And the focus of this debate was on whether financial reporting objectives were still fulfilled, so namely whether market-based fair values were able to faithfully represent the economic value of financial assets and liabilities. And arguably the aim of those fair value critics was to push or to convince standard setters to reconsider their standards. However, as we have seen, there was an inconsistency in the framing across the industry. So we had individual companies such as AXA. So there was a statement that I showed you on the one hand. So they were criticizing fair value accounting rules, but then you had the associations. So I showed you an example from the IIF representative, Josef Ackermann, who was backing up the practice of using market prices and to continue to use market input for determining fair values. And this is also consistent with what we observe in the US. So there we also had the American Bankers Association backing fair value accounting practices in the late 2070s, in late 2007. So overall, this allowed standard setters, of course, to stick to their transparency frame and to argue that change is not necessary at this point in time. Well, and this quickly changed when the situation changed again. So now we have early 2008, and in early 2008, banks and insurance companies had to release their financial reports for the past year, and they reported huge losses, and people interpreted these losses on financial instruments measured at fair value as yeah, actually being the result of fair value accounting, so a consequence of applying those yeah, strict fair value accounting rules, or as being exaggerated because yeah, fair values were not reflecting I mean, yeah, those market prices that are used as input to determine the fair value were not reflecting economic reality, but only a distorted reality, or those losses were actually justified because fair values were just, yeah, still reflecting reality. And yeah, here I have some examples for statements where people framed fair value accounting as creating reality. So now you have the American Bankers Association president in April 2008 and as well as in September 2008 saying that fair value accounting is pouring fuel on the fire and that it has made the crisis much, much worse than it needed to be. And also the IIF chairman changed his opinion. So he now says, well, fair value accounting is today's actually biggest problem. So this is in April 2008. And then you also have those IMF reports and from the Financial Stability Forum, another report that say, well, fair value accounting could actually result in exacerbating economic weaknesses. So now we observe those kind of frames that that suggest that yeah, fair value accounting is constructing realities. And on the other side, we still have yeah, statements that yeah, said, well, it continues to just reflect what is going on. We don't need to do anything. I didn't summarize it on that slide. So the bottom line of this frame contest on the responsibility of fair value accounting for the financial crisis would be that by October 2008, many constituents started to prioritize the financial stability objective of accounting, if you can define it as that, over the transparency objective of accounting. So most politicians at that point in time then also adopted this radical view of accounting. And yeah, according to this radical view of accounting, you can then argue as well that accounting is a social collective problem. So it is, yeah, in this case, undermining financial stability. And therefore, fair value accounting became a public policy issue. So policymakers started to push standard setters for changes. And as you may recall, in middle of October 2008, the EU pushed the IASB to amend IAS 39 and to allow banks to reclassify financial assets from fair value accounting categories into amortized cost categories. And they built the reasoning for why they were pushing for these changes, interestingly, not on this radical view of accounting, but on a more traditional accounting objective, namely to enhance the comparability of financial reports. And this is something that we connect to the fact that not all politicians, even in late 2008, but only most politicians were adopting the radical view of accounting. So they needed to sort of find a compromise solution on how to justify the accounting changes. And yeah, they did that by drawing on this traditional accounting objective, which was also very effective because yeah, the IASB did not have yeah, many counter arguments at this point in time to defend themselves from yeah, not granting or not enhancing the comparability of financial reports at that point in time. And if we look at what happened in the US, there the standard setters were pushed to provide additional guidance on what to do when markets are illiquid. So also on the definition of what actually constitutes an illiquid market. Yeah, and there you could say, well, in the US, even though we have a lot of people who were adopting this radical view of accounting, the solution or the treatment that they actually pushed through was only aiming at fixing an accounting problem in the US. So they only provided additional fair value measurement guidance to fix the problems with what to do when you have illiquid markets and how to find a faithful representation for the economic value of your financial instrument. And then let's go to the last step of our empirical the timeline that we were analyzing. So now you have this situation at the end of 2008 where Lehman and other companies crashed. You had the situation that standard setters were forced, or one means forced, they changed their accounting standards due to political pressure. So as I said before, the IASB amended IAS 39, the FASB published additional measurement guidances, and now people started to debate, well, those changes, they were actually not sufficient, and therefore the standard setters have actually failed to fulfill their purpose. Or, well, those changes are sufficient or more than sufficient. So to give you some examples, what kind of frames were used in this period. So we have on the one side people who argued that fair value accounting is creating realities and that standard setters should be forced to acknowledge this or should acknowledge this. So a representative example for that would be a statement by the American Bankers Association on October 13th that states that, well, last week the FASB had the opportunity to provide useful guidance by issuing this standard, but apparently still refuses to recognize the realities of the current situation. Simply put, the FASB has failed to take the necessary actions, and then they ask then they ask the SEC to take up this, the task of solving this, collective social problem, and to make use of its legislative powers and to issue, guidance on top of the guidance that the IASB had issued a few days before. And a similar thing happened in the EU. So their experts recommended that the IASB should not only focus on its traditional objectives as defined in their conceptual frameworks, but that they should also consider prudential regulators' objectives. And then on the other hand, of course, you had the standard setters that were defending their point of view. So they were stating that, well, the primary aim of accounting standard setters and security regulators actually is to provide transparency and comparability of financial information for investors and participants in capital markets. And they say, well, this is an objective that should not be sacrificed to to other objectives. So their core objectives are transparency and comparability. Another example would be a statement by the FASB chairman, Robert Hertz, who said that handcuffing regulators to GAAP or distorting GAAP to always fit the needs of regulators is inconsistent with the different purposes of financial reporting and as compared to prudential regulators. So accounting standards should not be purposefully designed to try to dampen business, market, and economic cycles. That's not their role. So accounting standards or standard setters should be allowed to focus on their core objectives, namely to provide transparency and decision useful information to the markets.
Kirsten, we have about 5 minutes left,
Yes.
and we've just had a flood of questions come in
okay.
in the last few minutes.
Well then, yeah.
So I'm going to how many slides have you got left? Do you have? You're okay to take a couple of questions and you still have time to conclude then?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. First of all then, Camilla, would you like to ask your question very briefly, please?
Hi, Kirsten. My question is about how this context could be applying some reporting that are not currently mandatory adopted in some countries, especially value-added reporting, because here in Brazil, we're still adopted in this kind of reporting. And I was wondering how this could be analyzed to the value-added reporting because of it. I was wondering how this could be analyzed in this kind of a reporting, thinking about the usefulness of fair value accounting to the other accounting users.
I suggest that in the interest of time, Camilla, can we pick that one up offline, please? So we
okay.
It's because it's quite a general one. And I'm trying to get through another couple of points, if you don't mind. Beatrice has asked about the links between your discussion and the market for excuses, Kirsten, from Watson Zimmerman's 1979 work.
Mm-hmm. I think this relates to Tim's question at the beginning, how relevant this analysis of our debate of this debate is in showing that people provided different arguments to public policymakers to justify their actions. And I think what you would expect actually would be that they pick up those financial stability arguments and then push for changes that address this issue. But what we actually observe is that they sort of open up a backdoor to outsmart the standard setter and use this comparability argument, for example, in the EU case, or that they were facing severe resistance by other constituents. So this is something that I jumped over in this part. So it was not only standard setters who defended the traditional view of accounting, but they received support by a large number of constituents. Therefore we did not see this change. But yeah, one can definitely link it to the market of excuses as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. Now, Rodrigo also has a question, but I think because we only have 2 minutes left, we'll just allow you to conclude, Kirsten. Is that okay?
Okay, let me see how I can conclude this last frame contest on the independence of standard setters. So what we observe here, so that would relates here to the bottom line, the 3 bullet points, is that the traditional view of accounting prevailed in this debate. So yeah, we see in the end that standard setters were able to shield their conceptual framework to the addition of other objectives, and yeah, that standard setters were also able to preserve their independence. Exactly, yeah, and this would just be the summary slide from before, where already presented the key takeaways. So our goal was to better understand the process through which accounting becomes a public policy issue. And the first takeaway here would be that people have to emphasize accounting objectives that are not part of the standard setters conceptual frameworks, and that we that you need to have this shift of the shared accounting belief systems in society to actually be able to construct an accounting issue that raises the broad political attention. And what we see is that the current traditional view of accounting, which is incorporated in standard setters conceptual frameworks, is actually quite robust. Yeah.
Perfect.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. That's perfect timing. We still have a few questions in the chat, which we will pass on to you after this. And for those of you whose questions we didn't quite get to, please feel free to contact Kirsten via email to pass on your comments. I'm sure she and the co-authors would be very grateful. In the meantime, I'd just like to say thanks again, Kirsten, for an excellent presentation on a fascinating project. We appreciate you very much speaking to us this afternoon. And just like to thank all of you for your participation in this seminar and in the previous ones, and to remind you that please keep your eyes peeled for news on the forthcoming seminars in the autumn. We're still waiting to hear about that. You'll hear soon. And remember that on July the 10th, we have the IASB workshop on the primary financial statements, and everybody's encouraged to participate in that. In the meantime, thanks again, and enjoy the summer. Look forward to seeing you in the autumn, and thank you, Kirsten, again.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for asking the questions, and I would be really happy to get the questions that I couldn't respond to afterwards.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks again, and don't forget, everybody, there's a reception after the presentation as well, and we hope to see some of you there as well. Thank you.